HRA meeting will start. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, August 15th, 2024. This is the meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and we've got some invited guests this morning. Thanks for being here, and also our public finance folks that are assisting us on a regular basis from Ellers. An important morning, I think, to be able to talk with our school district colleagues about tax increment financing, and our community development director, Bill Noondorf, I think has done a really superior job of putting together this presentation, so I want to compliment you for that, and all of your team that worked on getting this meeting pulled together, and it'll be really highly educational, not only for the HRA, but also for, I think, the residents of our community as well. This is our Director of Communications, Jennifer Benarott, stated we've been doing these meetings on a hybrid basis since the beginning of the pandemic and continue to do so folks can listen in online and call in if they want to for whatever's on the agenda that morning. There's usually two opportunities. If there's a public hearing, you get to call in for that. And then for community comment, and the number was just up on the screen, we're going to put it back up there. If you have something you want to address with HRA this morning that's not on the agenda this morning or scheduled for a future public hearing, feel free to call in. And if we have folks in the audience that wish to participate in community comment, they're certainly welcome to as well. Put that number back up on the screen because the community comment comes up fairly quickly. If you could, in the back room. There we go. So if you're watching the meeting and listening to the conversation, make sure you jot these numbers down. We'll have them back up on the screen momentarily. But having provided information, I'll call the meeting to order and ask Liz Olson, our planning administrator, to call the roll. Ms. Olson?
Commissioner Risser. Here. Commissioner Jackson. Here. Commissioner Pierce. Here. Commissioner Agnew. Here. Chair Hovland.
Here. Next is the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Kind of getting used to seeing the new state flag next to the U.S. flag. It's got some beautiful coloration in it. We've got a meeting agenda that's been published to the citizenry of our town and also for us. And does anyone on the HRA or at staff level wish to modify the meeting agenda in any form or fashion? Is there a motion to adopt the meeting agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Agnew moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the meeting agenda for their HRA this 15th day of August 2024. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Thanks for that. Next, we're going to go now to community comments. So if you have something you want to address that's a concern to you, an issue of concern to you with the HRA, feel free to come forward. It can't be on the agenda this morning or otherwise scheduled for a future public hearing. Otherwise, we welcome your comment. And we'll check on that first before we go to any online participants or potential online participants. Not hearing anything, not seeing anybody coming forward. Director Benarott, anybody online that wishes to address the HRA for any reason this morning?
It's very early, Mayor Hovland, and I do not have any callers, but because there is a slight delay in the broadcast, I would recommend that we wait 1 minute before moving on. My clock shows it at 7:34, so I will come back to you at 7:35 or when I have a caller, whichever is first.
Thank you.
It is now 7:35. What I hope is your longest minute of the day has ended, and I think it's safe for you to move forward with the agenda.
Thank you. All right, so nobody calling in a community comment as well, and then we'll move on to our executive director, who usually has for us responses to community comments that were made at the prior meeting, and can't recall if there were any or not.
No comments to respond to this time.
Okay. All right, very good. Next on the agenda is the consent portion of the agenda, and today there's only one thing on the consent agenda, and that's the draft minutes of the regular meeting on July 25th, 2024. Commissioner Risser has asked me to hold those over for further discussion because of the tight schedule that we're on. There were some comments she wanted to make about I think the content of the minutes or the lack thereof. Member Risser?
That is correct. They have lack of content for one of the items.
Don't keep pressing it.
Okay,
Come on.
all right.
Yeah. There's that delay there.
Actually, for both of there's two items where content is insufficient. Thank you.
So why don't we hold those over? You address those issues with staff, and we'll see where we get, and then we'll just address it at the next meeting.
That sounds good.
Okay. You move to hold the draft minutes of the regular meeting of July 25th, 2024 over to the next regular meeting of the HRA.
So moved.
Thanks, Commissioner. Is there a second?
Second.
Yeah, Commissioner Pierce seconds holding over those draft minutes of the regular meeting on July 25th, 2024, the HRA to our next regular meeting. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right. Now we'll move on to items that are part of our regular business routine here at the HRA, and it's the reports and recommendations portion of the agenda. And this is tax increment financing morning. It's all you ever wanted to know, way beyond TIF 101, I think. So I'm going to turn first to our Executive Director, Scott Neal, who wishes to provide some introductory information, and then we'll go to Bill Neuendorf.
Thank you, Your Honor. When we take up the issue of tax increment financing, no matter how big, no matter how small, there's always lots of questions and concerns about how that decision-making process affects other local governments, in particular schools. Schools are obviously very important. They play a role in our taxing and spending combinations in Edina. We have 3 school districts that are represented in Edina: Hopkins, Richfield, and the Edina schools. We've invited representatives from those schools to attend today to listen to this presentation. Our goal with this presentation is not to convince anyone that TIF is good. Our goal with this presentation today is to dispel kind of misunderstandings and misinformation about how schools are impacted by tax increment financing, so that you can make decisions based on that kind of information. So with that, Mr. Neuendorf has got the presentation queued up, and we'll introduce our presenters.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, good morning.
Morning, Mr. Neuendorf.
So earlier this year, this group, the HRA board, asked for more information about school district financing and how TIF impacts it. As I recall, that first request came shortly after we presented our year in review, which is our typical document we present every January of the year. So we've been working on this for a while, and this was a really good time in the year to have this conversation. It's a very timely moment. So this morning, we've invited our advisors at Ehlers Associates, who are advisors to the HRA in the city, but also advisors to the Edina School District, Richfield School Districts, and Hopkins School Districts. So Ehlers, as you may recall, is a third-party independent firm that specializes in public finance. So for the HRA, we rely on them for HRA financing or city financing. They also have a team that focuses specifically on school district financing, because one thing we've learned over the years is that the process for city financing and HRA financing is completely different from school financing. So we thought, let's bring in those experts. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt Hammer, Jody Zesba, and Nick Anhut, They have a presentation that was in your packet. They'll run through that and be happy to answer any questions when they're finished. And with that, the team from Ellers.
Thank you. Yeah, why don't you each introduce yourselves? We're familiar, of course, with Mr. Anhut. We see him on a regular basis, but
We do too. Good morning, I'm Jody Zesba with Ellers.
Matthew Hammer from Ellers.
And Nick Anhut from Ellers. Thank you.
good. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning.
Thanks for having us
Look
this
forward to
morning.
your presentation.
Great, so we are going to start out with the school district portion of TIF and financing, and we thought we would start just with an overview of school district funding. So we know this looks different than funding for cities. The pie chart that we have before you is a typical general fund sources of revenue for school districts. So you'll see that the largest category for school districts is state aid. And within that formula, you might hear the legislature frequently talking about the general education formula allowance, which is provided at the same dollar amount for all school districts in the state of Minnesota. Currently, that dollar amount is at $7,281 for the 24-25 fiscal year or this upcoming school year. So that's the largest share of funding that districts receive to finance their general fund and day-to-day operations. Next is local revenue, and these categories of funding are based upon a uniform accounting system that all school districts throughout the state need to use called UFARs. In our neighboring state of Wisconsin, it's called WOOFers, but in our state, it's called UFARs. So these categories are the same, and this pie chart looks very similar for each school district throughout the state of Minnesota. Within that local portion of the pie chart, the majority of the funding in that category are local property taxes, but there are some other categories within that slice of the pie too, including interest income and athletic and activity fees. So we know the school district of Edina in particular has some awesome athletic and activity programs, and they do collect some local fees to support some of those programs. Next is federal, which is a very small portion of the pie chart, and then other revenue, which is very, very, very tiny. So again, the primary source of funding for their operating costs in school districts is state aid. There's a maximum authorized property tax levy each year that's determined by state funding formulas. So they don't get to decide what the tax amount is. Districts can levy less than that amount, but not more than the amount authorized by the state unless it's approved by their voters. And there are 3 different categories of voter-approved levies. There's an operating levy, which all of the districts that are in the boundaries of the city of Edina have. There is a capital project or technology levy. Voters have approved those for all of your school districts here in the city of Edina too. And then finally, debt service levies, which are approved when bond referendums are put in place. So next, we'll take a look at a little bit more about property tax levies. So school finance and property tax systems in the state of Minnesota are very complex, but the revenue is primarily driven by enrollment, not driven by the tax base. So as property values increase, that does not mean that school districts are collecting more money, and that's a very common misnomer. So we often hear people say, well, there's so much development, there's a lot going on, certainly you're getting more and more funding for your schools. And that isn't the case. The funding is driven by enrollment. So we've put together, and there is one exception to that, and that's the one voter-approved category that I mentioned for technology costs. So that is driven by a tax rate, but that is the only funding formula for the operating portion of the budget that is driven by that tax rate. So we put together kind of a simple example at the bottom of the page there. You'll see that in the area that we have highlighted in dark blue, we're assuming there's a 10% increase in the tax base, but that the enrollment stays the same. So in this example, we're showing about 8,000 students with $2,000 per pupil coming from tax levy, generating about $16 million then for that tax levy. As the tax base grows by 10%, you can see that revenue doesn't change, it stays the same, but the tax rate then declines. On the other side then, in orange, we're showing if the tax base goes down, then you'll see that we're collecting the same amount of tax levy, the same amount of revenue for the school district, but the tax rate changes and actually goes up with the decline in the tax base. So the change in the tax base doesn't result in more or less revenue for the school district because it's driven by enrollment, but the tax rates then are a function of the amount that is generated because that per pupil amount is then distributed or spread over that tax base. So next, one of the reasons that, one of the contributing factors to the complexity of property taxes in Minnesota is that there are two different tax bases that the taxes are spread on. So that is different from other taxing jurisdictions. So we have a referendum market value tax base, and that's the taxable value of all of the property in the school district, but excludes a couple of portions of property, seasonal rec and agricultural land. So if you're in the Brainerd School District, that's a big deal. If you're in some of our outlying rural districts, that's a big deal when when most of their tax base is made up by agricultural properties. There are only a few categories of funding that are spread on this tax base. The one that would be most common for the school districts that we're talking about here in Edina is the voter-approved operating referendum. All other taxes then are spread on net tax capacity, and the value of the property, that value of property is calculated by multiplying the taxable market value of all of the properties by that assigned class rate that the legislature determines. So a higher class rate for commercial industrial property as compared to residential homes, for example. So we thought it might be helpful to take a look at the tax base composition. This is unique from school district to school district. So for the school district of Edina, you can see the different types of properties on the left-hand side, the overall market value as determined by the assessor, and then those two different types of property tax bases that I just mentioned. So referendum market value and net tax capacity are in those final two columns. If you take a look at the residential homes for the school district of Edina, they have a high share of their property tax base composition from residential homes at 70%. When you look at net tax capacity, the residential homes represent about 63%. So in that case, then commercial industrial is picking up a little bit higher share of the of that tax base and the associated tax levies. So at the bottom of each of the columns, you can see a description of the levies that are spread on those tax bases and about how much that represents of the school district's total levy. So remember the 70% of the residential homes for Edina School District and commercial industrial representing about 12% of the overall. And we'll contrast that now to the school district of Hopkins. So in the case of Hopkins, you can see that the residential homes are a much smaller share of the overall tax base at about 52%. And then that carries through to the referendum market value and how those are collected. And then finally, the net tax capacity then for homes represents only about 42%. If you look at the commercial industrial line, then they have a much higher percentage of their tax base that is represented by those commercial properties at about 24%. So they will pay and make up that portion of the referendum market value. But then importantly, you can see that on any net tax capacity-based levies, their commercial properties are paying for about 37% of those levies.
Excuse me, go ahead, Commissioner.
Yes, just for briefly to interrupt you, where do apartments fall in these classifications?
Apartments would be in other residential.
Thank you.
Apartments, condos, multifamily homes. Next then is the school district of Richfield, and this is much more similar to Hopkins. So you can see the residential homes, again, about that 50% level overall, and then paying at that level for referendum market value-based levies, but then declining to under 40% for the net tax capacity-based levies, and then commercial industrial making up about 22% of the overall tax base and ultimately paying about 35% of the net tax capacity-based levies. So now we'll get into a little bit more about the impact of TIF on school districts. So if the city or HRA creates a TIF district that results in new development and an increase in the tax base with no change in enrollment, so we'll just assume enrollment is remaining the same, for referendum market value based levies, because we have these two different tax bases that school district taxes are spread on, there's an immediate impact of growth in that referendum market value as the TIF property takes on a greater share of those levies. The result to the school district, though, is revenue neutral, and the district's either going to receive more money from the state, less money from the state and more money from property taxes, or they continue to receive the same amount of state aid, and then there's a lower tax rate for the existing taxpayers as that tax base is brought on, because we're not capturing any of those referendum market value, any of that referendum market value for the TIF. So next, again, we're assuming that the TIF district gets created with an increase in the tax base and then no change in enrollment. For capital project or technology levies, since that is a rate that's applied against the tax base, the growth in the net tax capacity causes an increase in revenue, but that is deferred until the TIF district is decertified. For all of the other NTC-based levies, because those are driven by enrollment, the effect on the school district is deferred until the TIF district is decertified. It's revenue neutral, and then the district will either receive less from state aid, more from property taxes, or the same state aid with a lower tax rate on existing taxpayers. The other topic that we wanted to touch on is the excess tax increment or surplus tax increment funds. So in a hypothetical example, if the HRA returns any unused tax increment during or upon decertification of a tax increment district, the county then redistributes that amount to each of the taxing jurisdictions according to their respective shares of the total local net tax capacity tax rate. However, there is a statute that limits the amount that a school district can keep of the money that's distributed to them. So they actually get reductions in their aid and levy formulas for the fiscal year when that excess tax increment is received, and they're allowed to keep a maximum of $25,000 in any calendar year. So they get reductions in their formulas, but they can keep $25,000. And that law has been in place for many, many years. I don't know the history exactly of that and why the $25,000 was arrived at, but we believe that really that was intended to kind of keep funding formulas equal and make sure that some school districts weren't benefiting more greatly from those distributions because they don't happen equally to all school districts. So again, that $25,000 is the limit that the school district can keep in any calendar year. So overall, just a couple of key takeaways. The school districts realize no loss of revenue as a result of a TIF district because the state formulas are driven by student enrollment. So I think that's been a common misconception, is that these TIF districts are hurting a district or for some reason taking some revenue away, but that is absolutely not the case. They are collecting their money based upon enrollment, and the TIF does not result in a loss of revenue. The tax-based growth as a result of TIF will reduce school tax rates for existing property owners. So that is a conclusion that you can draw. So no loss of revenue, but some declines in tax rates for your existing taxpayers. And I think we're going to shift over to Nick.
So thank you for that overview, and we wanted to kind of recap again, what is TIF in general and how does its mechanics work so that you can kind of corroborate some of that information. So it is a financing tool to help the HRA, the city of Edina, to enable redevelopment, support of affordable housing that you've used in the past. And it's an interim use of that property tax revenue that's generated from new development. So when we help incentivize a project to come forward, they redevelop a site that's at a lower value into a higher share of the tax base. And in TIF, we defer that net tax capacity benefit for a period of time until the TIF district decertifies, using those revenues to help actually finance and reimburse the costs of those projects. There are a couple of different property taxes that are not then captured within the TIF district, and primarily with commercial sites, there's a state property tax that is levied upon commercial sites. There is a commercial property share in the fiscal disparities pool throughout the metro area. That is also not captured. And then the last bit that directly impacts the presentation is that referendum market value. So properties within a TIF district, they contribute all of their referendum market value right from the start and continuously through that TIF district. They are not captured. Again, the funds are used primarily to reimburse private development costs or to fund infrastructure needs that helps support that development in the community. It also is a process that requires public hearing and vetting, and so there are notifications by statute that are required to be provided to both the school and county boards 30 days prior to any public hearing that is held at the City Council, as well as HRA approvals. There's a lot of information on this chart, but this chart is intended to show the taxes that are created from a property in a redevelopment situation. This would be a commercial example. On the far left-hand side, prior to a TIF district being established, you typically will see either a flat or declining value for a property that might be aging and needs to be redeveloped. At the point in time that the development takes off and is phased over time, maybe in 2 or 3 steps, that value of that property increases. It joins the tax base and creates additional funding capacity. However, with the TIF district, we are capturing most of that increase, at least as it relates to the net tax capacity of that property. The general share that you see here in the color coding, the fiscal disparities and commercial property taxes that are not captured, are at the bottom of the chart in the orange and brown. The local market value-based levies that help the school districts are in that Edina green. The base property taxes that are originating from the original value of that property do not also get captured, and they carry through during the life of the TIF district, and that's represented in blue, so that that property is contributing the same amount of funding potential through the entirety of the TIF district to the county, the city, and all the other local taxing jurisdictions. It's that red portion that's captured as tax increment revenue that is separately, is segregated once it's collected from the property, and the county remits it to the HRA for use in helping finance that project. And then the last bit that I'll point out is that light shaded blue area at the top. When we do create a TIF district, we also freeze the tax rate that is in effect at that time. So if there's ever an increase in the local tax rate during the life of the TIF district, the revenue attributed to that increase is also not captured within the TIF district. So it's in effect capped. Now, if the tax rate decreases, we only collect the amount associated with the tax rate. But if there is a point in time where local jurisdictions do need to increase their levies that causes a greater draw on the tax base, even on a net tax capacity basis, those revenues are not captured within the TIF district. So if the school has a referendum for a capital need that comes forward while that TIF district is active, this property will help fund that increase in overall tax rate. And then the light at the end of the tunnel is in green. At the end of the day, once that TIF district is decertified, all of that value comes back onto the general tax rolls and can potentially create either more revenue for the city and the county primarily, or a decrease in tax rate, as Jody mentioned, for the school districts, again, assuming their formulas remain generally in the same principle. So we wanted to provide a direct example of property within a TIF district, and we decided to showcase the property across the street. The Eden Wilson TIF district was created recently to help spur redevelopment of an old Perkins restaurant and a regional office. That property was at about $3 million, representing $3 million in estimated market value as part of the Edina School and Hennepin County tax base. And it was in a declining value, equivalent to about 0.02% of your overall tax base at the time. And it has now been redeveloped into a much larger site that creates a higher value. On a net tax capacity basis, it's now at 845,810, so a dramatic increase, and now represents about half a percentage point of the share of the gross tax base of the city of Edina. You can see on the school district, we also are highlighting the referendum market value change, which is generally the same for this because it is primarily a residential project, but it is a dramatic increase in the amount of tax value that's coming online right away. And so this property is going to be using that tax increment revenue during the time the TIF district is open to fund about $5.1 million in private redevelopment costs that took place on that site, as well as about $6 million in public roadway costs that we can all see outside of our windows here that are benefiting the entire tax base of Edina. Once all those reimbursements and bonds are paid off, then the property's net tax capacity will come back onto the general tax rolls, and you'll be able to leverage that for future levies or, again, help reduce tax rates for the overall populace within the community. But now the property is expected to represent over 23 times a greater share of the school referendum market value tax base, starting right away next year in '25. So it will provide immediate benefit that will result in lower tax rates for Edina schools. And this kind of just shows the same thing, the revenue that would actually be expected and how it's distributed. You can see on the far left-hand side, the bottom is the base property taxes that existed before the TIF district was created, when it was the old Perkins site. You can see the Edina, the Hennepin County, the other jurisdictions are going to be receiving generally the same tax base. They're going to be able to levy upon it, just as they were in the past. That is not captured when a TIF district is created. The state and fiscal disparities actually will be receiving a little bit less because we've now converted a 100% commercial site to a mixed use, which is primarily residential. So there's, that was a conversion in the tax classification, not, again, impacted from the TIF district. And then the last bit is Edina schools. Actually, this property will now represent a greater share of that overall levy for referendum market value, and you can see it's actually quite a dramatic when you compare them side by side.
Just to understand that, Mr. Anhut, if the school comes up with a new technology levy during the existence of this TIF district, there's more money available from this particular property for a special levy like that, as opposed to the general levy.
I would just say that this property is now representing a greater share of the total pie that the school district is levying upon, and so it will now provide, whether they change their levy or not. So during this period in time, we expect what's really going to happen, the school district's not going to receive any more money, but everyone else is going to be paying less in their property tax bills because now they're representing a larger share of that base. If the school was to adopt a new referendum or expand that, they would be able to draw upon this, and this would, again, represent a greater share than it was prior to the TIF district being created. I think the exception would be if it's a net tax capacity levy, it potentially will be deferred while the TIF district is active unless the overall tax rate actually goes up. That blue sliver on that previous slide that I mentioned, in that case, then it would not. But I know it's a bit complicated, but I hope I explained and answered your question.
No, it was helpful. Thank you.
And at the end of the day, once the TIF district decertifies, it not on this chart is the actual tax increment revenue, and it would be well off the scale at that point in time, the capacity that this property is going to be able to benefit the local taxing jurisdictions over 23-fold increases for all of those funding sources. So final insights, the HRA has used TIF strategically for certain sites as a tool to help achieve growth within the community. They've been able to deliver a number of different projects that have aligned with city priorities, not only for building out a public realm spaces that are beneficial to the entire community, achieving certain urban design standards, providing affordable housing within the community, and also incentivizing sustainability within those projects. It's a tool that is designed to incentivize private investment in those public realm improvements that help kind of enhance the appearance, create a desirable place to live and walk and play, and additional connectivity with some of the other infrastructure and other built environment within the community. And it helps, again, redevelop sites so we are able to transform vacant, outdated, declining property values within the community, primarily used for commercial industrial districts within the city. And it has provided funding for direct investment in public infrastructure and affordable housing with the streets and roadways and other types of infrastructure that have been funded over the years throughout the city. And finally, it helps grow the overall tax base. So primarily why we do this, and this chart just shows the existing TIF districts within the city of Edina, where they were at before and what has been captured as far as net tax capacity from those TIF districts year over year. You can see that overall, some ebb and flow. Affordable housing projects don't necessarily deliver a higher increase in tax base as much as a commercial site or a mixed-use site might. But even considering the affordable housing that's included within these TIF districts, we've seen over a 347% increase in tax base just attributable to these TIF properties over time. And this is just the current TIF districts. We've also got historical examples that would show that you've got 1,000 and plus % increases in those tax bases. So it does help grow the overall pie. Even though you're deferring it for a time, at the end of the day, you're creating a much larger tax base that will provide you additional resources in the future to fund programs, not only in the schools, but also in the city and the county. So we'd be happy to address any immediate questions. We hope this was helpful, and we thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Anhart. One of the questions we get periodically is, and I think you've addressed it within the context of your presentation, is that let's just use the Perkins site. I think you showed that it was worth $3 million it was estimated market value for purposes of property taxation. I don't remember the slide. But folks will wonder, well, if Perkins just stayed there and we didn't replace it with something worth $80 million, where we're waiting 25 years for a TIF district to lapse and have it all come back into the general fund, would that organic growth in taxation, that increment, where it might, taxation might track inflation, for example, would that period of taxation of whatever the length of the TIF district is be something that the school district would be deprived of? Because what I heard you say was that school district funding is primarily based on enrollment, and so that TIF is tax neutral. So for folks that are raising that concern, how would you address that? Did I make myself clear?
Yeah, I think so. One of the findings that the HRA and the City Council makes when they created TIF districts is that but for the use of this tool, we're not going to have the same type of development or growth that occurs. And so I think that's readily evident when you see a transformative project like this. But as you mentioned, there could be alternatives where, let's just say another entity comes in, buys out Perkins, and operates a similar business on that site. We'd expect them to make some modest improvements, maybe interior improvements to that building. It could result in a slight increase in the tax base, but maybe not as dramatic as what takes place with a large redevelopment. When that takes place, if there was no TIF district to incentivize that purchase, we would not expect to see any kind of change in enrollment or composition at the school district level, at the city or the county level. I don't know that there'd be any change in services. There wouldn't be a need to draw on those resources. So I think there would be negligible or minimal impact. And I think one of the determinations that we help facilitate and that you all make when you go through these transformative projects is that you see that overall benefit at the end of the 25 years is going to vastly overshadow that small improvement or inflationary improvement that you say over time. So it's not going to provide a different funding mechanism necessarily, but at the end of the day, you're making a finding that without providing that TIF resource, the city is not going to benefit as greatly as that alternative.
Commissioner Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to just take a step back and do, elementary tax law in Minnesota, or property tax law. So I'm going to say what I think it is, and you're going to tell me if I'm right. So oftentimes we think of, here's an asset, here's the tax on that asset, here's the revenue. But that's not how Minnesota property tax works. What it is like, here's the overall base in a taxing district, say a city or a school district, and then the school or the city sets a levy, and then the rate is what varies, but the levy does not vary. In another system, the rate is, so in Iowa, for instance, the rate is constant, and the revenue is what varies. So here we have more stability in our government financing, because we know what we levy is what we're going to get, and the rate varies on different properties. But in other states, it's the revenue that varies, and the rate is constant. Is that correct?
It can be
Okay.
that case.
I know it's so complex.
But I would say, the only caveat that I would say is that you use the term other properties, and I would say when the city adopts its levy, that is spread out in one tax rate to all properties within that community. There's not a differentiation in how that levy is spread. So if a property represents $3 million in value, no matter what its use is, that value or what its share of that tax base is, that levy that you adopt is going to be spread uniformly to it as compared to its neighbors. But yes, you are correct. So the city and the county have autonomy to set your budgets for the services that you provide and make sure that you're levying an amount sufficient to cover them. The school district also gets to levy a property tax, but as we mentioned, and I'll definitely let my colleagues step in at this point, they are a bit more constrained because they are dealing with state funding formulas, and they need to be able to demonstrate that they're, essentially being fair with a state resource that is spread throughout the entire state of Minnesota. So they are a little bit more constrained than the city council, but I think the rest of your statement is correct.
And we do have the one revenue category that is based on a tax rate, and so the revenue would vary from year to year for that. So as development occurs and the net tax capacity goes up, even without tax increment districts, they can enjoy some increase in revenue as a result of that voter-approved category.
Terrific.
And that's
Thank
only
you.
schools.
And then,
Go ahead, you have a follow-on?
well, I did, but I've forgotten it, so.
You were drifting back to your younger days in Iowa where they had the mill levy, I think.
That's right, yes.
Commissioner Pierce.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So thanks for the presentation. I had a couple of questions, and they may or may not be fair, so I'll just tee it up with that. I appreciate, Mr. Anhut, when you started by saying TIF is a vehicle for development and not the vehicle for development. So my question is, what are some other vehicles a city might use for development? We could use the Perkins site. You gave that example of how a private investor might come in and purchase that property. But what are some other vehicles that might be used that Ellers is aware of or may have experience with?
So I'm going to focus on financial, but there are definitely other avenues that the city can entertain to make development easier for developers.
Yep.
But I'm going to financial. So the city can adopt what's called a tax abatement, which is very similar to TIF, but the city deciding that its own share of those levies that are being put upon that property are going to be directly used to help fund whatever costs or incentivization is needed for that development. So that's a one alternative tool. The HRA has levying authority, so you can set a levy every year that collects, and you can use those funds generally to incentivize redevelopment. You could use that levy to fund different types of loan or grant programs within the community that are targeted towards certain types of development or needs that you want to see through. There are other public resources like tax credits, historic preservation, and those are federal funding tools, but the city can help facilitate those processes as well as maybe supplement them. There are various types of grant programs that are administered from other jurisdictions. So there's a litany of other things, but the ones I mentioned there are kind of the primary tools that cities in Minnesota will use.
So that was probably the easy question.
All right.
So,
and I'm going to let Jody answer this.
The follow-up, though, and I'll try to simplify it just to stick to the first two you gave. tax abatement, and then the ability to set a new levy for development. So just stick to those two. Give me the pros and cons of TIF versus doing a tax abatement, and then the third one, setting a levy. And then I'll just frame it for you. I really don't have an issue if the city, as a city, if we decide to use TIF. But often, the way this gets framed is that we either do TIF or this development doesn't get done. And so I know there are other vehicles that we could look at. What I'm more used to, and this is a business example, if we have a project, we might look at all the various funding models. You might do a pros and cons, and you might say, we don't want to do TIF for this one. Or, you know, I'll use an abstract example. I have a checking account, a savings account, and a credit card, and I want to buy a vehicle. I have all three of those as options, and I may have my pros and cons as a purchaser to decide how I want to do it, or I might decide to take out a loan. But there's all pros and cons for that. And so I appreciate the presentation very much, but that's the question I have. Like, I want to know, what are the pros and cons? What tells us TIF is the best option for this? And I know you're not making that call, but understanding how Ehlers might view the pros and cons just against those three. So TIF, tax abatement was your first example, and then the third one was setting a levy for the city that would be earmarked for development.
So I think there's two maybe categories or two ways of thinking that I think need to be addressed in answering that question. And the level of risk that the city wants to take on, and then the capacity of the funding.
Okay.
And so when we are utilizing tax increment, we're usually able to harness a greater degree of funding capacity for that project. And it's isolated to that project and the new value that it potentially is going to create. You know, these are very uncertain what the future may hold for that development. And there's a lot of work that the property owner, the property developer needs to do in order to get to the point completing the project, you know, which has many steps in it along the way, actually running a successful business that sustains that value over time, paying their taxes into the pool and creating the funding source. But the capacity that's created within that is much higher than those other tools.
Okay.
And it does not incur necessarily additional risk to the city in terms of providing upfront dollars out of your own funds. And we often utilize what's called a pay-as-you-go financing method. So we're reimbursing costs after the fact. The developer needs to demonstrate that they actually built the project the city wanted, that they actually incurred the costs that they said they were going to, and then they are provided access to that TIF revenue stream to reimburse those costs. So there is little to no risk to the city for any out-of-pocket. We can set up an abatement in a similar fashion, but it is going to be maybe 20% or 25% of the funding capacity that a TIF district could create. And the way abatements are, they're actually levied on an annual basis, and they might actually incur some level of risk to the community in terms of dollars that you actually could have spent on something else. The last one is the HRA levy. Those are dollars that are generally available for use. They are your funds, and so you would need to use them in a way that means that you are putting them out there to assist that development, whether it's through a loan, whether it's through some other type of financing vehicle. And so you would be on the hook, I would say, whereas in a TIF district, typically we're deferring that risk to the developer. They need to demonstrate and incur all of the upfront expense, and then we're reimbursing it over time. if that helps.
Yeah. No, thank you.
I thought those were very fair questions.
That wasn't the topic of the presentation, though, but thank you.
Well, and to that point, we have some of our friends here from our own school district. The finance director is here. And I don't know whether you'd have any questions or anybody else involved from either Hopkins or Richfield or here would want to have any questions they'd want to advance. If so, we'd like to have you come up to the front here so we can record the question.
Questions, Ellen does a great job.
All right. Thanks. That trigger anything from anybody else? Any other commissioners? Commissioner Jackson?
Yes, so I do have a question for the school districts, and that is about the notification process. And if you could, would you mind coming up and telling us a little bit about what it's like to get a notice for TIF and how you respond?
And identify yourself for the record too, please.
Good morning, Mark Woodard, Director of Finance and Operations with Independent School District 273, Edina Public Schools.
So, Mr. Woodard, if you wouldn't mind, one of the things we're going to be talking about is a new TIF district and sending it to the City Council for a public hearing. If we send it to the City Council for a public hearing, we'll send notice to the school district. You get a letter from the City of Edina saying we're going to have a TIF district. Can you tell me who do you talk to about that? Just walk us through, once you get that letter, how you respond.
Yeah, I haven't actually received a letter from the city in my time in the school district. Those may have been routed to the superintendent. We review the TIF district, perhaps reach out to a member of City Council or one of the staff at the city to understand the project. I think the city and the school district have a very strong partnership, and we believe in development within the school district and in the district's boundaries. So we would probably support that. I know we don't have any say whether you proceed or not. We would simply fulfill our statutory obligation of confirming receipt of that letter and responding to it.
And does it go to the school board in this process?
There is no school board action taken on those.
There's no school board action taken, but I think the letter itself is directed to the clerk, right, of the school board, just as a technical matter.
Okay. So everybody's fully aware of what's happening, and if there are complaints or concerns, you have the opportunity to send it back to us.
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Woodard. Good to have you here this morning. All right. Our folks from Ellers, thank you so much for being here, and stand by. We may have something that comes up in the context of our subsequent conversation here on another topic. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, so Ms. Zesboth and Mr. Hammer, thank you for being here along with Mr. Anhut. All right, thank you, Manager Neal and Manager Newendorf, for putting that together. It's really, I think, important for us to have that conversation relative to potential impact on school districts when we use TIF. All right, and then that brings us to the next part of the agenda, which is a conversation about 7235 France Avenue, and we started having this conversation, I think it was July 25th, late July, and held it over here so you could present yet again the proposal. And to be clear, we're kind of at the front end of this conversation about whether we want to start exploring the use of potential use of tax increment financing in conjunction with the 7235 France Avenue project.
Great. Yes, thank you. So when we last, where we left off on July 25th was in your request and your discussion, and as part of that discussion, you asked us to look into a few items, the process involved in considering TIF and TIF term sheets and agreements and how all that fits in. You asked for some clarifications in the term sheet, and you asked for a few changes and improvements to the term sheet. So in the packet, we've included a lot of information, including an extraordinary amount of background information, just to have it all in one place at your fingertips. I don't intend to go through a lot of that, but it's out there for you. What I was going to run through this morning is a little bit of more detail about a process. There's a lot of questions about that last time. And then a summary of the changes that we made to the term sheet Then would love to turn it back to you for your consideration and discussion. So just a bit on background. So for decades, Edina has used tax increment financing to create places that people seem to love. When we do surveys, people generally identify places that were built with TIF as some of their favorite places in Edina. So we've turned gravel pits and sand pits into parks. We've turned 50th in France from a small business district with 4 gas stations on every corner to a place that people love with shops and restaurants. And we've turned an old industrial district in Grandview into a place with condominiums, senior centers, and parks and libraries. Why is TIF even a discussion, right? Wouldn't it be great if every project could be self-financed? And most projects in Edina are, quite frankly. We use TIF on maybe, I haven't done the numbers recently, maybe 10% of the projects. 90% of projects in Edina are privately financed, and we don't even talk about them as an HRA. But it seems like these bigger, more ambitious projects that are on larger sites and delivered in multiple phases are much more complicated to finance. So what are some of those hurdles? In a built-out community like Edina, we all know in order to build something new, you have to tear down something old. And there's a lot of cost and expense in that, both the demolition costs plus the site prep costs. In this particular location on France Avenue, that all used to be the sand pit and the gravel pit. And when they filled it in the 1970s, they just filled it with what they had. So in order to build something new, you're not just tearing down a building, you're doing a lot of excavation and getting rid of the junk that was used and replacing it with something that's suitable and buildable, and that's very expensive. We've all heard the conversations about construction costs. Costs really skyrocketed during COVID, up depending on the type of commodity, double, triple in many cases. These 2 graphics show the cost construction index over time, and it shows that huge jump in around 2020 and 2021. It has started to level, that's the good news, but the costs are still very, very high. And then the graph on the bottom shows some example costs of typical commodities in a construction project. Plywood costs, lumber costs, the price of copper, the price of PVC, all up dramatically. And when you buy a home or rent an apartment, you're not going to pay more just because that piece of PVC pipe that connects to your kitchen sink costs 10 times as much. The consumer isn't going to do that. And then the cost of money. The financing costs have changed dramatically in the last 2 years. A few examples there. A few years ago, typically a mortgage lender would provide a loan valued at in the range of 75 to 80% of a project. The rest would be private equity in the deal. These days, the banks are willing to lend a lot less, in the realm of 55 to 65%. That construction mortgage is the cheapest money in the deal. So now they have to not just go to their typical investors for about 20% of the project, it's 30% of the project, 40% of the project, maybe even 50% of the project in some cases, and that all raises the cost because those equity investors have their money completely at risk. If there's any project disruption or default, their money's gone, so they're going to want a higher return. And that's just the state of the financial world that we're in today. And of course, we all know that interest rates have gone up dramatically. At the bottom chart, that shows the prime rate doubling, getting close to triple in the last couple of years from where it was just 2 years ago. So the cost to build and the cost to finance these projects are very high. We wish it wasn't, but that's the state that we are in today. And then one other thing to also consider is the cost applied by City of Edina standards. Over time, the city has established standards for PUD zoning, and while we use PUD to come up with a zoning configuration that's more suitable to achieve city goals, it's more expensive. It's more expensive to build that. In Edina, we have higher standards for construction materials. We have higher standards for public realm spaces. A lot of our planning provisions strongly discourage surface parking, which is the cheapest way to park a car. The cost to build structured parking is double, triple, sometimes 4 times the price. We have our affordable housing policy, and then we have our newer sustainability policy. All solid, good policies, but it costs money. For a project like this, millions. It adds millions to the project. So just as a reminder, I'm not encouraging we change that, but there's a price for all these extras we ask the developer. And then there's the typical fees. We have development fees in Edina that are pretty much in line with other places. But for this project, the park dedication fee, for example, in order to pull a building permit on the site, the developer will have to write a check to the city. I forgot the exact amount, around $2.8 million to the park department to use for park improvements throughout the city. That's standard city policy. We apply that to every project where the state law says we can do those kinds of things. But again, that adds money to the project. It adds benefit to the general community. So there's a lot of challenges, right? Financial markets, construction pricing, our own standards, and that's where the role of the HRA really becomes apparent. The HRA can help with public financing to make projects that meet all of our goals and standards, to make those possible to build and to finance. I'll walk a little bit through our process as we consider TIF, and I'll put it in a graphic that combines the regulatory approvals as well as the financial approvals. So first, these first several steps are taken by you, sitting as a city council or as a HRA board members. Of course, staff helps prepare them. We hire outside advisors to do the technical work, and there's a fair amount of public engagement in each one of these steps. So from a regulatory perspective, the first key step is securing preliminary zoning approvals for a site plan. That's done by the city council as a regulator. Once that preliminary site plan is achieved, that's where you as an HRA step in. We've identified that there's cost hurdles to this project, and so we've prepared a term sheet asking you, based on the preliminary plans that you approved, here's a way to get over some of these cost hurdles. And we do that to get your general guidance. So it's something you can live with, something you can support, something you're excited about, or something you're adamantly opposed to. But our policies specifically call for this order. First, the preliminary zoning. If that's successful, then let's start talking about the terms. With your consent, we would like to proceed drafting a TIF plan and actually getting into all the full legal documents, getting those prepared. That'll take a few months. So that's the step that we're at today. The next steps on this project, and this process is typical for everyone, is the final zoning. That's currently scheduled for mid-September, on September 17th. So if the project advances past final zoning, you can expect that we'll be back sitting as a HRA, actually looking at the TIF plan, giving that consideration. We'll also be looking at a redevelopment agreement. So today we have about a 40-page term sheet full of pictures and some high-level comments. That will be developed into probably a 400-page legal document that's suitable for consideration and signing in the future. But we'll only get to that point if the project secures its final zoning. If it fails to do that, we're going to stop with the TIF conversation. But each of those steps are what we do as public officials. And at the conclusion of those steps, if they're all successful, then the developer and the architects and the engineers really get to work, because they've got to do all the construction plans, prepare documents that are suitable for bidding to get firm pricing, because everything up until that point, the pricing it's fluid, it's estimates. They're not sure what is the content of that final approval. So once they lock in those approvals, then they can really get to work, and that takes time, months, sometimes more than a year. After that point, the city's involvement is really pretty rudimentary on a staff basis. The zoning's been approved, the TIF term sheet and redevelopments have been approved. So at that point, the only steps left are for staff to carry out your directives. So the building department would issue construction permits. The HRA would receive a letter from the developer saying, yes, they've got their permit in hand, they've got their mortgage lender lined up, they've got the cash in their escrow account at the title company, and they're going to break ground on Tuesday. That's the go-ahead letter. Then they have to build it. That takes months, years to build the projects, especially large ones like this that are actually 4 separate buildings. When all that is finished, the building department follows up with a certificate of occupancy, confirming that everything was built to code, built to the zoning requirements, et cetera, and safe to be occupied. After that step, the HRA staff, the city staff, follows up with a TIF certificate of completion to make sure that not only did they build it safely and follow all the construction rules, did they deliver all those easements that were promised? Did they make the investment that they promised to make? Did they hire the companies they promised to hire? Did they provide the public realm space, the artwork, the parking, the affordable housing? Everything that was promised, we go back and double and triple check that it was delivered. When that's the case, we issue a TIF certificate of completion. Once we have that piece, then we wrap it up with the final step, and that's to issue the pay-go note. So there's several steps in the process to make sure that they followed through with what they said they were going to do. And at the conclusion, from an HRA perspective, we award them a note, which is basically the IOU. So they've made the investment, they've taken on the loans, they've taken on the risk, they've taken on all the risk of construction, and in return, they get a piece of paper from the HRA that says, yes, if you pay your taxes in the future, we will return a portion of them to you based on the agreement we signed a couple years ago. So the reason that we try to consolidate some of these steps is that it takes time. It takes a lot of time. So if we would wait to start the financing discussion after they've received all their final approvals, we just added 6 to 9 months to the process. And America moves a lot faster than that. So that forces us to be responsive. So in an overview, that's a quick look at our processes, our policies of how we've gotten here. What I'd like to do next is go through the highlights of the term sheet. And so the presentation I have, it's the same as last time, so I'm not going to go through every slide. I know that you guys want to talk about things. But just know that we have made changes to the term sheet, and this is a little bit unusual for us, but we submitted them to you in the strikeout underline format. We wanted to make it clear and obvious to you what the changes were. So in your packet, that's why it's some is black print, some is red print. It looks kind of messy. But in general, these are the things that we changed based on your directive last meeting. We clarified the purpose and intentions of the term sheet to make sure the context was better understood. We clarified the pending nature of these final zonings. About a week ago, the developer did submit their packet for final zoning consideration. So we added some language in the term sheet just to clarify that we're not getting ahead of ourselves. We also clarified the application of the but-for test. But for the use of TIF, can this project move forward? Based on our evaluation, we found that but-for TIF, it won't go forward. So we clarified that. We also put footnotes on each of the renderings to clarify that these are just preliminary placeholders. These are the renderings that were approved by the City Council in June, but they are not the final approval. So there's a footnote on each of those pages to make sure that's understood. We did have conversations with the developer to encourage them to increase the length of time that the affordable housing will be affordable. They are open to that conversation and willing to move further down as we get into the redevelopment agreement. We added provisions to make it clear that the affordable condominiums can't be flipped for a massive profit after the first owner. That, of course, was our intention, but right now in the term sheet we have about 3 sentences about the condominiums, In the final legal agreement, that'll probably be 15 to 20 pages, so we'll make sure we get those kind of provisions in there. We've also made sure that there's clear access to and from the public parking. We've amplified the importance of grants and applying for grants. It's a little bit too early at this point in time to apply for those grants, but if the final approvals are secured in September, we hope to get our first grant application in November, followed by one probably in the spring of 25, another one by the August deadline of 25, and maybe even one in 2026. So that's all on track, but we're not at that point yet. And then while we do have a general catch-all to make sure the developer complies with all state and federal requirements, based on your suggestions, we did add language just to make it even more clear that they're required to address all fair labor standards. And we did make it extra clear that they're required to address all design standards for handicap accessibility, the state laws, the federal laws, et cetera. That was all baked into a kind of catch-all statement, but based on the level of comments and concerns, we broke those out as separate items. So that's a quick overview of the red line. And the project itself, I'm just going to I'm going to just cut to the chase with this, because we've seen this multiple times. We have all the renderings, we have the site plans, we have all the explanation of the public benefits that can be delivered on the site. Happy to have any conversation or use these renderings to assist in the conversation. But to suffice it to say, the project is the same today as it was 2 weeks ago. We did make a few clarifications, as I just summarized. But the project does have a lot of potential to deliver public benefits that are not realized today and wouldn't be realized without this project. I'll stop here for a moment on that France Avenue pedestrian crossing. We did a brief update at our last meeting. We do have that we had planned on talking about that more today, but we pushed that to later in the month. But this project, along with the companion project on the other side of the street, certainly could provide a lot of funding for that kind of public infrastructure if that's something we do want to pursue. The affordable housing benefit, we changed this slide. Our current policy calls for a 20-year minimum term of affordability. We've already been negotiating with the developer to increase that to 25 years, and we will continue at your urging to push that as far out as we can get. Public parking is still a public benefit. All of the sustainability benefits are there. Also urging the contractors to do a better job that has been done historically to engage and hire underrepresented people on the job site. This is primarily women and people of color. There's a nuance here where there's state and federal laws that say we can do some things, and those laws also clearly state there's a line of what we can do. And so we feel we've balanced that provision. But the project financing is still the same. The potential tax impact is tremendous. We have the same slide about the current tax collections. Right now, the site pays about $350,000. During the TIF district, when the project is finished, it'll pay about $3.6 million, so a 10-time increase. And then after the TIF district, it still pays about the same, but the dollars get reallocated a lot differently. And we still have the slides about the gap. So that's fundamentally why the HRA gets involved. There's lots of potential public benefits, and there's financial hurdles that prevent those from being delivered. Our gap analysis is the same. And so just in closing, a couple questions for you to consider, and I think these were refined based on last week's conversation. But to me, fundamentally, looking at what's been prepared and evaluated, to me, it's a question of whether or not this proposal delivers a suitable degree of public benefit. The developer is asking the HRA to step up with a pledge of future financial support if they deliver these benefits. So to me, that's kind of how I do my calculus. Is what they're delivering worth that money? And secondly, if we do, well, to minimize risk, we always recommend that we use these pay-go notes. That keeps the risk on the developer side. Is the use of notes warranted or justified to achieve those public benefits? In staff recommendation, we believe that it is. If you have a contrary opinion, we would love to hear that. But if your opinion is contrary, we should really consider, are our standards and our extras really what we want to ask developers for? If we ask them to add all these extra costs, that makes their project unfinanceable. And if we're not willing to support it, should we reconsider a lot of these standards that we've adopted over the years? So the final action, it's our staff recommendation and our suggestion this morning is to get your support to authorize staff to draft a complete redevelopment agreement based on these term sheets. Now, drafting that agreement is not approving that agreement. We would come back to you later in the fall with the full agreement, get all the details worked out. We would then present that to both the City Council and the HRA. We'd be notifying the school districts, the county, all the regular folks that we're considering the use of TIF. But in order to start with that process, we're looking for your consent and authorization. And I'll leave it at that this morning. There's a lot of content. We've got a room full of experts. Nick Anhut has worked extensively on the financing. Jay Lindgren has worked thoroughly and quite a bit on the term sheet. And both developers, Patrick Brahma from Enclave and Ben Landhauser from Lifestyle Communities are here. We're all available for your questions and look forward to your conversation.
Thanks, Mr. Newendorf, for that presentation. Commissioner Jackson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So last time I had a whole list of questions, and you and I sat down and talked, and someone asked me, did we have anything in writing? And we didn't, but the presentation that you've done today encapsulates the conversation that you and I had. So I want to thank you for going back and clarifying all those things, and then to present them to the public as well. That's really helpful. I think I want to start, I also raised some questions about assessment, and so I met yesterday with our assessor and our city manager and went through the process. And I'm a policymaker, so I'm not an assessor, but what I learned is that assessors are very highly regulated, both by state law and by professional standards. And it really is not at all linked to our policymaking. They follow the rules, and that's how assessments are done. But as a policymaker, I'm going to summarize that what I learned is that the assessment is based on what is there now, not what could be there in the future. And so, we talked a lot about Maison Green. It was a Perkins, a functioning restaurant, and that's what the assessment for purposes of TIF was. And so I think it's really important that we as policymakers aren't the ones who set that. That's set by state law and by professional standards on top of state law, in addition to. So the assessment is, in my interpretation, and I think it's accurate, that the assessment is based on what is actually there. And that was a really important thing for me to learn. And then going to the TIF terms, we talked a little bit last time about what does the but-for test mean? And again, this is controlled by state law. And the but-for test is not broad or general. Is this specific project going to go forward without TIF? And if it is not, then the but-for test is met. So but-for TIF financing, this specific project won't go forward. And I just wanted to clarify that because, we're just seeing a lot of change and it's happening rapidly. And so I kind of want to stop and look at some of these fundamental principles. The second one is a misconception, a belief that I had when I was first elected and prior to that we have this PUD process. It's a give to get, and that we give a little bit more height, a little more density in response for public improvements. And that's part of it. But I think you did a really nice job of fleshing out the details of why PUD is not sufficient. So we still have a give to get with the PUD, that we allow more height, more density in exchange for things that we as policymakers have set forward, so public policies. But the greater density, greater height does not pay for all the public improvements that we have asked for. So, and I think you and I said that, or when we were talking, you told me, of course, we have not changed what we're asking for, but the cost of what we're asking for has gone up considerably. And so PUD does give us the give to get and trigger a lot of public policy options, but it is not creating enough wealth in this particular development to pay for all the public policy, public benefits that we are asking for. And so I'm satisfied, but I do want to put out some questions. We're going to have a public hearing on this, and so we want to know, are the public policies that we're asking for supported by the public? And that's the purpose of a public hearing and comment period. So some of the things that I wanted to highlight that were in the term sheet that you gave us last time, and you went over redevelopment, and that this isn't simply tearing down a building and putting up a new building. It's a very complicated redevelopment on this site, having been prior gravel pit. We were asked, we have a green building policy and an inclusionary housing policy. One of the things that I've learned in the last couple of discussions we've had about affordable housing is that the cost of these inclusionary housing units, the cost goes up dramatically the nicer the building is. So that lost rent is dramatic, and the nicer the building, the more dramatic it is. And so it's very important. We've talked a lot about the importance of meeting our affordable housing goals. Inclusionary housing is a very special kind because it's not distinguished from other types of housing. So there's no stigma of living in affordable housing. The units are the same. And that's an important policy that we have to help meet our goals. One thing that has not been highlighted, which is very important to me, and that's the fee paid for maintenance of Centennial Lakes. We get the park fee. That goes to hardscape. That's playground equipment, things like that. But it doesn't do the mowing and the weeding and the plant replenishment at Centennial Lakes. And one of the concerns is that we're going to be bringing a lot more people in, and we're not going to be getting the tax revenue to service Centennial Lakes for the term of the TIF. And so one of the things that you've been able to negotiate for us is a maintenance fee for Centennial Lakes Park. And that's really important, especially as the other properties around Centennial Lakes, their agreement for maintenance is sunsetting. And so the Centennial Lakes maintenance fee is significant in this term, and I want to know if that's something that the public is approved for. I love, Mr. Anhut described it as urban design. It's the 200 by 200 foot grid, but I like that term, urban design. We're paying for that. That's land that will be put under an easement that's going to be publicly available, that is not profitable for the developer. And they're going to be maintaining that. This is the Southdale design, to break it into the super blocks into smaller bits, and that costs money. So that's a public benefit that I'd like to hear from the public. And then finally, I'd like to hear what the support level is for the potential pedestrian pass under France Avenue. So those are all matters that as we go into the public hearing process, I'm going to be looking for feedback from the public on. They're important to me, but I want to make sure that that we are sitting here representing the community and not just our own personal opinions. So again, I'm just going to summarize that one more time. Redevelopment, green building, inclusionary housing policies, the fee paid to maintain Centennial Lakes Park, the urban design 200 by 200 grid layout, and the pedestrian pass under France Avenue. So those are some really big, unique things to this site that I'm looking, I think are public benefits. They way outstrip the cost or the income that the redevelopment will make on this site, but they're important to us, and I'd like to hear the public response to that. So thank you all for the background information on this. It's been really, this is a complicated project, and I think that we've had the opportunity to dig down a little bit more to explain to the public what's going on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm going to go to Commissioner Agnew, then Commissioner Risser.
Thank you. So I specifically want to talk about the section related to affordable housing, particularly because this is the one I will say I was most hesitant to include as a line item within the TIF district, because I do feel that including affordable housing is just like the bare minimum for what we require in developing within Edina. And so I don't necessarily feel like it's something that should be included within the TIF financing. However, as I'm reading through here, right, I do think that there are some really tangible benefits to us as a city by including this language in here to hold them to a contractual agreement, right, on what does it mean to do affordable housing, especially as you refer to the owner-occupied units and ensuring that those aren't just flipped. So I have two questions. Whether or not you know it today, I want information on, if we remove the line item for the affordable housing, would everything else still stand? Is there enough of the other components that we would be financing that would still fall within that total amount that we're proposing today? And would all of that still stand? And I see you looking for papers, so you might know this, you might not. But that's one question that stands out to me, and I'll pause if you do have an answer for that.
I have a best guess. I haven't done the math that way. The state law that governs TIF identifies a whole range of eligible expenses. Some of those we like in Edina, others we don't. If we were to, my gut says, without doing math, my gut says that if we were to remove the full cost of affordable housing, I don't think the project would pencil. We could substitute other eligible costs. We could put in more for parking. We could replace the affordable price or the affordable expenses with private parking expenses. We could replace it with the acquisition cost. That's also eligible. The challenge is our TIF policy says we shouldn't do that. So there's probably some creative way to get there. We've got a great team that can figure it out in a lawful way. But then we'd be looking for a waiver from our own policy. Just historically, we've not subsidized private parking. We've helped reimburse for public parking. So that's something you might want to discuss with your colleagues. But there's a way to get there, but we'd be doing some dancing on other policy issues.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So going maybe just one layer deeper into the actual language then that's used within this section, I see a lot of uses of shall as opposed to must, and I'm nervous that that's going to leave too much wiggle room. Can you speak to the word selection?
That'd be a legal issue.
Yeah, I'll speak to it generally, and Jay can get into the details. But when I prepare these, shall is mandatory, should is wiggle. You should stand up straight when you're at a podium, versus you shall speak into the microphone, otherwise no one will hear you. And to me, I always think of shall and must as the same context, but I'll refer to our legal expert.
Good morning, Ms. Chair. Commissioners, I think of shall and must meaning the same thing, and I'm sorry, I'm old and gray, and I use a old-fashioned language. I'm the one that uses shall. I think it means must. I think it's a mandate.
Mandatory. Mm-hmm. Yep, I concur.
And I would say that then we go from the term sheet into the redevelopment agreement, if that's your wishes. I thought that language would be very tight and show what the mandates are, I believe.
Okay, and that's how courts see it as well?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else at this point in time, Commissioner? Commissioner Agnew?
I'm just reviewing my notes and making sure. No, I think that's all for this.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, go to Commissioner Risser, then Commissioner Pierce.
Okay, I want to thank Mr. Lindgren for clarifying at our last meeting that this is not a commitment, but it is indicating that we're generally going in the right direction and a signal to keep going, and that's what's being asked for. And for me, I am very concerned about the direction that we are heading. And part of my concern stems from the fact that this process, I would say, elements of it, particularly the pedestrian crossing, began a while ago. And back in February, we made an agreement to fund $80,000, a study by LHB that would give us a deliverable within 3 to 4 months of the options. And perhaps it would be narrowed to a preferred direction. We would, in that agreement, they would investigate the need, the scope, the intent. They would assemble a project-based mapping tool, and we have not received that. So I feel as if I'm, and I have brought this up, the scope, does this make sense to put a public pathway between 2 private developments? At our last meeting of the HRA, Mr. Fisher from LHB did note that they had done a pedestrian watershed study and that he would bring it to the next meeting. This is the next meeting. I still have not seen that. So I kind of feel as if there's factors out there that I don't have that I need. I realize, though, back to the site in question, the Macy's site, and whether the proposed plans merit TIF investment. Going back and looking at last meeting, we were told that at the very initial stages, the developer said he would need TIF because of the condition of the land. And one thing I hear from a lot of people is that the land values in Edina just keep skyrocketing. And a question I have is, why isn't the land conditions factored into the price that is going to be paid by the developer for the land? We do, when we do PUD in Edina, we do it differently than other places do. When we rezone to PUD, we are committing to a specific site plan. We're committing to subdividing. So it's this one big swoop that comes down and changes the land values significantly. And so, while we're looking at an estimate of $12,149,000 right now, when it's subdivided, the estimate given for all 3 created parcels goes to $25 million. So we're increasing the value by that act alone. So there's a lot of benefits that the developer is getting. The other thing is we keep getting this binary narrative. But for TIF, this particular project, which must have TIF, will not go forward. And if you do that, if you don't do that, then you're going to be stuck with the Macy's site forever and ever. And nobody else is going to come up with a plan. And I think that's a false narrative. When I look at the list of public benefits, number 1 is remove an obsolete building from a prominent site. Macy's is still functioning. People go there. My neighbor said, I was there last weekend. I would argue it's not an obsolete building. So that is something that I'm concerned about. Back to process. LHB that's doing the study and also presenting designs for the underpass is also a third-party consultant for the TIF terms. And LHB is the one in this TIF agreement that inspected the Macy's site and found it to be in a condition that potentially qualifies it for redevelopment. LHB was awarded the $80,000 study. And when I look at today's Sun Current, we do have quotes from LHB about the progress on this project, which is going to turn out to be a $15 to $20 million project. So I'm feeling very uncomfortable. When we award TIF, that's public financing, okay? And I feel there needs to be a process that is super transparent and one that is not looking as if it is going. The end result has been obtained already, and it looks like that's kind of the direction that we're heading here. So I do have concerns about that. I have concerns we're running out of time, and I have other issues. Another resident told me that this idea for an underpass is complicated by the fact that the existing PUD 16 for the 7200, 7250 site requires an access road for vehicles off of France. So, I mean, there is a lot here that's coming at us. The other thing, if we could go back to the list of public benefits, one that's been talked about for a really long time is that the developer is going to maintain the park trail. My understanding is that there's a permanent easement there. That is an essential character of the parcel. Okay, and the other thing is when you look at this parcel, we keep hearing it's an 8-acre site. Well, there's roads on it. If you took away those roads, what would it be? And I feel like what we're being asked to do is to take this site that already has an existing commitment and take this site that really is not 8 acres of buildable land. And we don't talk about what the buildable acreage is. We just talk about the whole site. And I feel as if we have gotten into this situation where TIF becomes a financing tool to take a parcel that has existing issues that should be, calculated and considered part of the market value, bring in the free market. What is it actually worth? And what TIF is going to do is say, okay, well, we'll let you count the easement that is there. We'll say that you're doing a good thing by maintaining it. Well, that's a commitment you take when you purchase the land. I'm sorry I've talked kind of quickly. Again, we've had another meeting where council only speaks at the end and we really don't have time for a dialogue. And I want to leave some time for other commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Pierce.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So a couple of things. First off, Mr. Norndorf, thank you for your presentation. And I think you nailed it for me. So we've exchanged some emails on this, and I think your slide 34 slide 34. I think that nailed it for me, the questions. And so what I've been trying to frame, you are essentially asking us if we believe, if we step back, that this project, and then you're actually forcing us to step even further back to say the companion projects with the underpass, if we believe that there's community benefit and does it warrant public investment. And so when I do that, it was so easy. I wasn't here when that decision was made on Centennial Lakes because it was a gravel pit. Right, it was probably easy for that council maybe to say, yeah, we should invest in that. There's nothing out there. And so that might have gone through a little easier. What we're looking at now is harder because there is existing value in that quadrant today. But if you step back and you can imagine the Centennial Lakes, that promenade, at some point in the future, expanding across France, right, to the other side and creating a venue where people can walk through an underpass, participate in the promenade. There's additional spaces there that can be utilized. It just takes more effort. Right, it takes more imagination, maybe I'll put it that way, to be able to step back and envision that, whereas before, it was a gravel pit. So we could have put a circus there, and that would have been better than what was there before. And so that was never a question for me. My question was, well, then from a process standpoint, we never do the opposite of saying, here's the vision. If you want to expand the promenade, that's going to cost you an extra $2 million. If you want to do the underpass to connect these two, that's going to cost you an extra, whatever, $5 million. And then we'd be able to sit back and go, all right, is it worth that? Can we fund that? If we think it's worth it, how can we fund it? That's why I asked Mr. Ellers, all right, well, if we were going to do these, then what are the vehicles that we have? from a process standpoint, that seems logical to me that we would lean into it and be able to ask those questions. But we kind of do the opposite. We look at the project, we apply our policy, so you ask that very pointed question. We add all these things to it to increase the public benefit. That's why we're doing it. And then we come and we say, all right, well, that's gonna cost, and I'm making these numbers up, that's gonna cost $22 million to do that. And then we go, all right, well, we need to fund that. How are we gonna do that? And I think that for the city, like, we can't answer those questions when you're in an HRA meeting asking for funding, right? That's kind of the ship has sailed at that point, from my perspective. However, as a city, Mr. Neal, we could say, all right, got that framework. Maybe there are some things we need to tweak in our process. We got to lean into that outside of this room to figure out what of these vehicles make sense, which ones don't. Some have inherent risk, others don't. I love the answer of, well, if you do an abatement, it doesn't create the capacity to do the investments that you want to do in this space. That seems logical to me. So if we want to do the underpass, if we want to extend the promenade, it's $5 million. We need to create that much capacity to do it. That seems logical to me. And so what I'm always looking for is the logic in the process for which we make the decision. And personally, I do like to have levers and choices, right? I'm just used to that. I think most of us are used to having options and choices to make as we look at developments. And so I think your slide 34, that coins it for me. I want to be able to do that moving forward in a more public forum so that people really understand what we as a council are valuing. And then the due diligence of, yes, we considered all of these vehicles, but we think this is the right one because we need more capacity or what have you. So thank you for that. The only question I had, and maybe it's just another ask in that process piece, one of the concerns I have when we do projects of this capacity, and I think we see it with Mason Green, if you follow a typical market process, and I'll use Mason Green, you probably would tear down Perkins, or you might renovate it, and I don't know, maybe it goes from a Perkins to a Red Cow, or, you know, and then that goes there for a little bit, and then Red Cow, that gets torn down, and maybe there's, you know, a two-story apartment complex that goes up there. And so you kind of follow this market, what the market needs gets developed there. And I use that example because sometimes I think I like that flow because it allows for services to grow along with that. And so sometimes I have this concern that if we grow too quickly, too big, and we're not able to have the underlying services to support that kind of growth, eventually the market's gonna adjust, and we could find ourselves in a place where we don't have all of the underlying services that we need to service the capacity that we have. And that's when I ask the questions around traffic and things like that when we talk about the Macy's site, wanting to just make sure we're doing that, running those scenarios out into the future. That's not really a question, but I think in the process, as we think about that, it would make a lot of sense to me to be trying to come up with scenarios to make sure that we're able to provide services along the way. And so, yeah, this one other clarification with the affordable housing, I did just want to make clear, I didn't quite understand the question, so I asked Member Agnew, we don't want to pull out the requirement to have affordable housing, we just don't want to pay for it. right? And so I kind of missed that, so I wanted to make sure we definitely want it in there, but the question of we don't want to pay for it actually fits with the frame that I talked about earlier, because that could reduce the amount of TIF that we might need if the developer is covering the cost of that 100% on their own. So I am in support of saying, yep, we've all given feedback on what should be in that term sheet. You've done a preliminary of that, and then doing the rest of the work to finalize that. And I'm sure that we will continue to have other questions of things that might go in there. We're going to do a public hearing. And I know I have a couple of other follow-ups with residents on this too. And so there might be other feedback as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Member Pierce. Just a couple of overarching thoughts, because I'm supportive of this as well. Taking this next step and this sequencing that you've done, I think is pretty interesting. I mean, the logical sequence might be that you wait until there's a final approval, see if there's a final approval. They met all the conditions of the preliminary approval. We have preliminarily approved this matter. They've got certain things they have to do for you to be able to come forward from a staff level, you and Kerry, and say, yeah, they did everything that was on this to-do list that the council put together, and now they're ready for final approval. And then go to the TIF conversation. But I think it's much like, it's a bit akin to this construction project that's going out here. They're resurfacing the road right now, even though they don't have the retaining wall thing figured out. Well, they're trying to figure out how to piece things together to make things operate as effectively and efficiently as possible. You're doing the same thing. And I think that's something I'm comfortable with. In terms of this but-for test, first of all, I would say, I had Ms. Olson make me a copy this morning of our tax increment financing policy. And you go to the back of the tax increment financing policy on page 9, and we got 25 things that we think about before we use TIF in Edina. And at the top of the list is delivering public benefits. And then it's the but-for test. And they're related because we ask for all these public benefits that you've described in your presentation this morning and in prior presentations. We've got the potential capacity to maybe do something under France Avenue, maybe not. It doesn't, that's still early in the stages here, but you're posing that as a possibility. And so we reach a point where we've asked for so many public things that the but-for test application, to me, embraces all those public improvements. And we're saying, well, the but-for test application only applies if the project goes forward if the, let me read the language, the but-for test for the use of tax increment financing, but for the use of tax increment financing, the project will not be constructed. Well, that's because we've put in all these public elements. I mean, if we've easily got, what do they have, 42% of the project is public use in the space? So we've created ourselves, I'm trying to figure out a way to articulate this well, we've created ourselves the obligations, we put obligations on the developer to do these things that we want to do that have a public benefit. And that's caused us to be in a situation that if we don't want those public benefits, then this is probably just a regular old project. But if we want these public benefits in there, then the but-for test is applicable because we can't do the project but for having all these public benefits in there at the cost still that they have. And I guess I figured out a way to say that in a somewhat artful way. So in terms of the affordable housing issue that Commissioner Agnew raised, I thought it was interesting, but I thought one important factor that you raised was, I thought about Maison Green. We did 10% affordable down there, the minimum, but we only got 15 years. So I think let's also think about the duration that we're going to get out of it. That has public value. Yeah, so I think let's not forget about that as we move forward. TIF itself is a leveler mechanism, as I recall from working on this over the years. It's designed to let cities like ours that are fully developed be able to compete effectively for economic development with cities that are all greenfield or have a lot of greenfield space available to them. So what do you find on France Avenue? The reason that key located piece of property, kitty corner from Smack Shack, hasn't been developed is because that was where the Edina dump was. And the soil conditions and the environmental conditions are so bad over there that it requires a significant public investment to make that work. And I am sure that when Enclave went to negotiate the purchase price of this property, they knew what the soil conditions were, and the price is probably reflective of that. But soils conditions and environmental conditions are things that we can think about in order to make us more competitive with greenfield cities. And so when we think about that being a factor in improving soil conditions and allowing things to be built out there, you think of the TCO project over there, they had to put that on pilings. I think the cost of that was about $6 million just to put it on pilings to make sure that it didn't start collapsing. So there are challenges out there that if we think it's important to be able to develop these areas, and it's a great piece of property, that 8 acres, then these are the kinds of things we have to think about as potential public investments, and you've done that for us, you and your team, and I thank you for that. So we're going in a good sequence. We're taking our time and carefully looking at all of this. We're being very transparent and public about what we're doing. And we're going to think about now this morning moving on to the next step, which is allowing you to come up with a term sheet, which is non-binding. I mean, you've got to kind of put together, you don't have an approval on the term sheet with somebody else. And then we're going to move on to a proposed form of the redevelopment agreement. And we're authorizing you to enter into that negotiation. But to the point you made early on, until we approve that redevelopment agreement, we don't have an agreement. And so we're going about this in a very logical, methodical way, I think, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm in favor of taking that next step and moving forward. So does
Mr.
anyone?
Chair?
Yes, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to respond to Commissioner Pierce's comment about too quickly, too big. And I think it's important, this is in the Southdale area, and the Southdale plan is transformational, which means it's not going to change gradually. The zoning code allows the Macy's building, furniture store to be turned into a Perkins. That would be perfectly acceptable. We wouldn't be having this discussion. It could change gradually. To implement the Southdale plan, that's transformational. And from the discussion that I heard today is that this subdivision and recreating creates an exponential amount of new wealth, whereas gradual transformation does not. I'm a big fan of the Southdale plan, and I think its potential is really extraordinary and innovative. But I don't think, if we are talking about incremental growth, that means we're not going to support the Southdale plan. Or a developer can come in and change it incrementally today without any discussion from us. So this is an opportunity for us to have this transformational change. One thing that we haven't talked about, and I don't know the forum to do that you mentioned, is are we, as a city, wanting to put public funds into this transformation? And I think that's the nut of what we're talking about today. So we are asking for big transformational change. The request today is, are we going to put public funds towards that transformational change? And that's why we're going to have a public hearing. This is a big deal. There's a lot of process around it, but we're not going to be alone in making this decision. We want to hear from the public on that. So I just wanted to lay that out there. So
Yes, thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you.
You gave me time to think of one other point I wanted to cover, and that was, this isn't in our TIF policy, but we have generally taken the position sort of informally amongst ourselves as a council and with you as staff that we're not going to use TIF. We're going to try to make sure that we look hard at being able to use TIF where in a situation where it represents less than 10% of the market value of the project. So here we got a proposed, I'll call it a $300 million project, and I think you're at about the 7 or 8% level on potential TIF funding. And I thought that was an important consideration as well, even though that's not embodied in our TIF policy. So I thank you all on that team for that too, including the developer. So do we have a motion to authorize? I don't know what's going on upstairs, but they're on the roof putting in that new solar. Is that what it is? Is there a motion to authorize staff to engage Dorsey and Whitney and Ellers Associates to draft a TIF redevelopment agreement based on the term sheet that we've seen this morning for the 7235 France Avenue site to be presented to the HRA board and city council for further consideration after the pending site plan secures final approval?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds. The motion is stated. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
The motion is
Nay.
approved.
It came on late.
Yeah, no, I got it.
Okay.
The motion's approved, and that will authorize staff to engage Dorsey and Whitney and Ellers Associates to draft a TIF redevelopment agreement based on the term sheet for 7235 France Avenue site to be presented to the HRA board and city council for consideration after the pending site plan secures final approval, which will be sometime in September. And then quickly, Mr. Neuendorf, I think this won't take too much time. It's a logical sequence here that we set a public hearing in this matter, and Commissioner Jackson has talked quite a bit about that this morning, and the importance of the voice of the public here on this idea of TIF increment financing being used at that site. Go ahead.
Correct. So the last item on your agenda is consideration of Resolution 2024-06. And what that resolution does is forward your recommendation to the City Council and ask the City Council to schedule that public hearing. I did rewrite some portions of this resolution to make it crystal clear that the public hearing about tax increment financing would only occur after the project secures its final zoning. So if it doesn't pass that hurdle, then we would not hold that public hearing. And with that, certainly staff recommends that this resolution be approved.
Questions for Manager Neuendorf on this particular matter? Yes, Member Risser.
Okay.
Commissioner.
In the agreement that you marked up today, item D, it says that the city has engaged Dorsey Whitney, Ellers Association, and LHB, collectively third-party consultants, to provide assistance in preparing the studies and evaluations. With the motion that we just made, is it only Dorsey Whitney and Ellers? Is LHB still part of the three-party consultants?
LHB was not named in the motion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The work that LHB did, their TIF evaluation division was completed several months ago, so that work is finished.
Thank you.
All right, this resolution 2024-06 requests the City Council of the City of Edina call for a public hearing on the proposed establishment of the 72nd in France number 3 tax increment financing district, a redevelopment district. Any further questions from Manager Neuendorf on the issue? Does someone care to move that passage of that resolution? Commissioner Agnew moves. Second. Commissioner Pierce seconds. The adoption of resolution 2024-06 as recommended. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption resolution 2024-06 say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. The resolution 2024-06 is adopted. And Executive Director comments, any?
No comments.
Okay. And Commissioner comments? Commissioner Risser?
Yesterday was the first online meeting for the FAA regarding the conversion to RNAV, and today there's an evening meeting. And people can go to the FAA website. We did post information about that online, but if you would like to learn more about that, there's a meeting tonight, I believe it is from, you know what, I'm not going to say it's online, and I did not bring that information with me. But it was good. Questions came in yesterday, and I believe it did run over time. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, is there a motion?
Just real briefly.
Commissioner.
Continue to shop at 50th in France and 44th in France during the construction. This is the Economic Development Board, and we want to make sure that our businesses stay vibrant. They're open. I was down there yesterday. Lots going on. So shop local.
Must have been in the air. I went down there yesterday too, and I thought, I better go do some, look for sale opportunities, yeah. Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Commissioner Agnew moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds the motion to adjourn the meeting of the HRA this Thursday, August 15th, 2024. Any further discussion on that? All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. HRA for the City of Edina stands adjourned this Thursday, August 15th, 2024 at 9:32 p.m. a.m.